Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much. And good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see all of you back for our virtual gathering. And I can tell you this is a no miss. I'm glad you're all here. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kate Clifford Larson today. Dr. Kate Clifford Larson is a New York Times and Wall Street Journal best-selling author. She earned a bachelor's degree and a master's degree from Simmons, an MBA from Northeastern, and a doctorate from UNH, specializing in U.S. women's and African American history. MTA retired members know of the quality of Dr. Larson and her works through her memorable presentations at our last two gatherings. Through her presentations, we came to know the stories of strong women like Rosemary, the hidden Kennedy daughter, Harriet Tubman, who was bound for the promised land, Mary Surratt in the plot to kill Abraham Lincoln, and Fannie Lou Hamer, a civil rights icon whose biography Dr. Larson is currently completing. Today, we will hear the story of a member of a Boston Brahmin family, Helen Sturrow. I'll hear about her connection to Sturrow Drive, and most importantly, her place in the women's suffrage movement. In this 100th anniversary year of the 19th Amendment, and again, this presidential election year, I felt this workshop connecting us to the importance of women appropriate but necessary. So I emailed Kate last year asking her to present for us at the gathering. She kindly accepted, not knowing where or how or what would happen with this gathering, and I'm so grateful she did accept. So without hesitation, it's my pleasure to introduce to you for a return visit to our MTA gathering, Dr. Kate Clifford Larson.
Well,
welcome.
Thank you for that great introduction, and I'm excited to be back here again. And I get to talk about Helen Sturrow, who I discovered her story way back in the 1990s when I was in a graduate program at Simmons University. And I just fell in love with her, and I think she's a remarkable human being. And her story and her connection to suffrage is a little bit different than most. And that's why I like telling this story, because it shows what women were doing at the turn of the last century. It wasn't just all about getting out the vote, because there was so much in their lives that they were trying to change, and the vote was a means to an end. But there was tremendous activism surrounding the effort to get the vote. So, and Helen kind of gives us a window into that, and also about what was going on in Boston at the time, just a little bit. So let me start here. There we go. So Helen Osborne was born in September of 1864 to a very politically and socially active family in Auburn, New York. She was the granddaughter of Martha Coffin Wright and the grandniece of Lucretia Coffin Mott, who were both women that were involved in early women's rights, and they were the architects with other people of the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls in 1848, Seneca Falls, New York. And Helen's father, David Munson Osborne, was a very successful manufacturer in Auburn. Actually, they made tools for farming, and eventually the company was bought out by International Harvester, which might be more familiar name to all of you, that makes farm equipment. And her mother, Eliza Wright Osborne, was very active in abolition, anti-slavery, women's rights, and many other issues of the day. So she grew up in this well-to-do household in central New York with amazing people coming through her house all the time. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Anna Howard Shaw, all these very famous women's suffrage women, as well as abolitionists. Her brother Thomas became quite a social reformer, and he became an advocate for reforming prisons and how prisoners were treated. And she also lived less than a mile down the street from Harriet Tubman, another favorite person of mine. And so Harriet Tubman was a frequent visitor in her household as well. In In 1891, Helen Osborne met Jim Storrow. She met him actually in Switzerland. She was hiking up a mountain. She was a tremendous athlete, and so was he. And he was a classmate, a Harvard classmate of Helen's brother, Tom. And so they met in the 1880s and courted for several years. And finally, they got married in 1891. Storrow was a member he was a descendant of many New England founding families, and the Cabots, the Lees, the Higginsons, the Jacksons, Oliver Hazard Perry, a Revolutionary War hero. And he was a prominent lawyer in Boston and businessman. And the funny thing is, Helen had to move to Boston, and she was kind of nervous about moving there because he had such a big family and it was connected to everybody. It was sort of this Boston Brahmin community. But they were a very close couple, and they shared their love of the outdoors and hiking and swimming and canoeing. Here's a picture of them canoeing. So they had a very active personal life as well. So they had a son named James. They had one child named James. And they were extremely wealthy because Jim was a partner in the firm of Lee, Higginson and Company, and he was also a co-founder and chairman of the board of Nash Motors Company. And he was just very smart and had a great financial mind, a great business mind. So he made a tremendous amount of money very, very young. But he and Helen were very committed to social reform, like her family in particular. And they were inspired by the plight of immigrants in big cities at the turn of the last century, and they became very concerned about what was going to happen to them. Jim Storrow believed in the doors to America should be open to everybody. And he had one of his closest cousins was Henry Higginson, who founded the Immigration Restriction League. So I often think about what some of those family gatherings were like, with Higginson arguing, close the doors to all immigrants, and there's Jim Storrow, like, throw open the doors and let them all in. Jim helped found the Boys Club of America, and specifically the West End Boys Club in Boston. For any of you that are listening to this, maybe you know relatives that grew up in the West End. And he was particularly concerned about the plight of newsboys and their struggles to make money. And he and Helen both believed in education for immigrants to help them improve their lives. So he funded the high school and college education of many newsboys. So at the turn of the century in Boston, as you all know, there was tremendous immigration throughout the country in the last quarter of the 19th century. But the North End became a very crowded, elaborate community of immigrants and working poor. I would say about 1860, most of the residents of the North End were Irish. But by the turn of the century, that had changed, and the majority were Italians, and European Jews that had started coming starting in the 1880s to Boston. So the neighborhood got, it grew, doubled its population, even though the housing stock did not double. There were about 28,000 people living in a very small area. You all know what the North End of Boston is like. And they were divided by race and language, religion, and certain streets were, certain ethnic groups would live on certain streets. There were some multi-ethnic streets, but like Stillman Street, mostly Jews lived on that. Hull Street, mostly Italians lived on that, but they all worked and crossed the streets together. But the poverty was overwhelming there, just tremendous poverty. And one resident talked about, she lived on North Bennett Street, and she said that her family, I think there were 10 of them, lived in 4 crowded rooms with beds in every room, a toilet in the cellar, and plenty of bed bugs. So if that just sets up the look, and the smells of the North End between the trash and the horses and the vegetables and the meat markets, it was just teeming with a lot of stuff. So there were a lot of progressive reformer women in Boston, including Pauline Agassiz Shaw. She was the daughter of Louis Agassiz from Harvard. Her stepmother actually founded Radcliffe College. She came from a very privileged, well-educated family, and she was concerned about education for children in general and immigrants specifically. And she was invited by Associated Charities in the 1880s to establish a kindergarten in the North End at one of a place that they called their home for, wayward whatever. And so she agreed to open a kindergarten. She was deeply influenced by the founding women of the kindergarten movement, Elizabeth Peabody, Mary Garland, and Rebecca Weston. But within a year of being in this facility run by Associated Charities, Pauline Agassiz decided, a kindergarten isn't enough. We need to provide education for all of these immigrants. So eventually she sort of took over the building, and Associated Charities pulled away from the building. And because they did that, which Associated Charities is a Catholic organization, Pauline made sure that the programming in the building was not religious based, that it was so that it would appeal to all the different ethnic and religious groups in the area. So the Boston Cooking School opened up in the building, and then they started classes for carpentry and printing, and a library for boys, and then a kitchen garden for girls so that they could learn how to have a little garden. Not that there was any place in the North End for them to have a garden, but also then they started cooking classes for girls and sewing classes, etc. The Boston public school system became a partner with her programming, but all of the programs were funded privately by wealthy Bostonians. And it became North Bennett Street School. Here's a historic photograph on the left, and today, as it still is there, it's still operating as a school in the North End of Boston. So it also attracted a lot of other reformers, young men and women, particularly women, who were interested in doing something outside of the home at the turn of into the 20th century. This is a photograph of the carpentry classes for little immigrant boys in the North End, and this just stuns me. I don't know how old this little boy is, but to have a saw like that is pretty stunning. So, but they taught them carpentry, and the girls sewing, and which was very, very typical. Some of the women that became involved, like Helen Storowood, started becoming frustrated with the educational programming that was for girls, because it was always about housework. It was always about the domestic sphere. Everything that they did for immigrant girls was domestic training, either for their own homes or to become servants in wealthier homes, like for people on Beacon Hill or whatever. So, and a lot of people at the time believed that the plight of poor immigrants was solely due to their bad housekeeping habits. It was incredible the things that they would write about at the time, that and they believed that if you teach girls Latin or Shakespeare or math, advanced math and things like that, classic literature, that they would become lazy and not want to clean their homes. So they didn't want to train these young children in the classics. And one North End resident, I remember doing my research, and one of the women that I was focusing on talked about how the girls were the drudges and housework and chore, while all the boys had fun doing, having real classes and also having more interesting training classes. So in the 1890s, after Helen had gotten married, had moved to Boston, and she had already given birth to her son, James Jr., she joined the board of North Bennett Street School. And she was also at the same time a member of the Board of Visitors of the Boston Public Library. And she felt that she needed to be actively involved in the city. And she was concerned about immigrants as well. And being part of the Boston Public Library was important to her, very, very much so. She learned through the North Bennett Street School Board of the difficulties facing immigrant families. And she made a strong financial commitment to the school, like many other wealthy Bostonians. She did too. And she started to fund specific programs for boys and girls at the school. So she started to notice that the classes for boys were far more interesting and more fun and served their intellectual needs too, and not that of girls. So at the same time, she met librarian Edith Guerriere. Her photograph is here on your left. And she was a young New England woman, college educated, very interested in reform herself. And she was a librarian with the Boston Schools Public Library System. And they had recently opened a branch library of the Boston Public Library in the North End. And it was housed at the North Bennett Street School. And so Edith Guerriere became the head librarian there. And I'm showing a picture of her lifelong partner, Edith Brown, who was an artist, and the two of them had met while taking classes at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And Edith would become a very important part of what was going on in North Bennett Street as far as art training. She became a teacher there. But Guerriere and Storrow found they had this same intellectual passion about reading and literature and the library. And together they conceived of a library club program to provide intellectual resources to immigrant women and their daughters. And by the turn of the century, it was mostly Jewish and Italian women. I'll come back to Guerriere and Brown in a little bit. So this was the reading room, the public reading room at North Bennett Street for boys. They segregated the reading rooms. There was one for girls and women and one for boys and men. And the branch for the public library, it was interesting. They had, let's see, the reading rooms, they kept records of who was going into the reading rooms and the population in the North End. There was an overwhelming number of more books and more seats for boys in the reading room for boys and men than for the girls. But Edith Guerriere changed that. She had an outreach program to bring more women and girls into the library, much to the chagrin of some of the families who didn't want their daughters going to the library. But be that as it may, she was successful. The more girls she brought into the library, the less the boys came. And by 1905, there were well over 1,000 volumes of books in the boys' reading room, but still only about 500 books in the girls' reading room, even though triple the number of girls were going there. So this shows you, even at that, these are things we don't think about, the discrimination against girls, how even resources like books were not equitable because no one thought that, or the powers that be thought that girls didn't deserve to have the kind of literature and expansion or opportunities that boys did. Edith Guerriere was not going to be deterred. So Edith Guerriere also realized that a lot of immigrant women couldn't come to the library because they worked during the day, and a lot of immigrant children, by the time they're like 8, 9, 10, they're sent out to start working. So she decided to start a library program at night on Saturday evenings. And it was for older women. It began for older women, and it was Saturday evening. So women that were 20 years old and older were welcome to come. And the club was hugely successful, really successful. These women that worked all week, didn't have children, were still young, would come and they would read literature. They'd have great speakers come and speak to them, social reformers, etc. Well, it was so successful that over the next 10 years, Edith developed story hours and girls groups that numbered, I would say, about a dozen of them, and they met every day of the week. So there were the Tuesday girls, the Wednesday girls, the Thursday girls, the Friday evening girls, and the Saturday evening girls. And by 1910, there were about 250 members in these clubs, and they would do dancing together, and they would listen to the Victrola. This is a group of little children. There's someone donated a Victrola, and they're listening to it. They had speakers come, and they did lots of different things to enrich these young children's lives. And the Boston public school system really liked what was going on, and they tried to adopt some of the new ideas that were going on in North Bennett Street School. And Helen Storrow was a huge champion for this. She kept advocating for more resources and more interesting programming that was being developed, because all these young women, well-to-do, well-educated young women, wanted to do something outside their home. So they became the club leaders. They became teachers at North Bennett Street. They started becoming teachers in the public school system, and they were learning new theories of education, and they were studying social science. So they were using all these new techniques for the children and helping them to learn English, etc. And so it was a huge, huge success. The Saturday evening girls group was so popular that the girls could not wait until their opportunity during the week came for them to go. And on Friday evenings, there was a group, and it was difficult for young Jewish girls to go to this club because of religious obligations. And one Saturday evening girl, when she was a Friday evening girl, talked about having to sneak out of the house on Friday nights so that her father didn't notice that she had taken off so she could go to the Friday evening meetings. And Helen Storrow she provided so many funds to pay for the teachers, the books, the resources. Who knows, she might have even paid to have the Victrola there in that room. Now, Edith Brown, who I showed you a picture of before, who is the artist, she had been teaching clay modeling for quite many years at North Bennett Street. But the clay modeling classes were only for boys. They would not allow girls to take the clay modeling classes. So, but she was very talented, and she and Edith Guerriere really felt that pottery would be a great craft and another option for girls to take. There were a lot of pottery. There was a big pottery industry in the metropolitan Boston area, and a lot of these young boys would grow up and go and work for some of these potteries. And they thought, well, why can't girls do that too? So Helen Storrow approached the Board of Managers of North Bennett Street, and she asked them to approve the establishment of pottery making classes for girls and women. And the North Bennett Street Board said, no, we're not. This is just for men and boys. It's not for girls. So she got ticked off and decided, well, forget that. We're going to start a pottery. So she sent Edith Guerriere and Edith Brown to Switzerland to learn the latest techniques and all sorts of different things about pottery making. And they came back and they started training the girls in making pottery. And Helen Storrow was so thrilled and excited by this. She bought a building at 18 Hull Street, Copp's Hill, in the North End, just up the street from the Old North Church where Paul Revere hung his lantern. And she bought this building and they retrofitted it to become a pottery making establishment where they could teach the Saturday Evening Girls and all the girls in the different clubs and any other women and girls to come and learn pottery making there. Originally they called the pottery the Saturday Evening Girls Pottery, and they sold the pottery through their bowl shop there on Hull Street. And the Storrow and Guerrier and Brown recognized that a lot of these young girls could not attend the library meetings or do all these other classes and learn different things because their parents needed them to work, earn money to help to support the family. Well, by working in the pottery, the girls could make the pottery, sell it, and then take the money home to their families so that they'd have better opportunities for higher education. So, and for those of you who are aware of social reform and progressive reform history, there's a famous settlement house in Chicago that was established by a woman named Jane Addams, and she called it Hull House. Well, in honor of Jane Addams, there in 1908, Helen Storrow, Guerrier, and Brown named this building that Storrow bought Hull House. So the girls felt tied into this larger progressive movement there in the country, not just in Boston. And these are just pictures of some of the girls. That's Lily Shapiro, and this is Sarah Gallner making the pots. They became some of the most famous artists in the pottery. And these are just examples of some of these tiles and the pottery that the girls made. The New England, I think it's called Historic New England now. The organization has a beautiful collection of Saturday Evening Girls pottery, and so does the Museum of Fine Arts. Eventually, they changed the name of the pottery to the Paul Revere Pottery because they were just down the street from the Old North Church. But Helen's passion really was education and encouraging young women to be part of what was going on in the present day. And even though she was concerned about their financial well-being and understood that it was necessary that they work to earn money for their families, she realized that there was more to it. So she helped them start their own newspaper. From 1912 to 1917, the Saturday Evening Girls, which I'm referring to all of the girls together, published a newspaper called the SEG News, and it focused on issues such as immigration, education, and social reform, democracy, employment, religion, issues about religion, other community issues in the North End of Boston and in Boston in general, and social news about the girls themselves. The newspaper was edited by a woman named Fanny Goldstein, who was a Russian-Irish immigrant, a young woman who came with her family in the 1890s. And she was brilliant, but she was denied an education. But she was so smart, she picked up so much on her own. And Edith Guerrier hired her to be an assistant librarian, even though she didn't have the education. But she was brilliant and beautiful and wonderful. And so she was the editor of the newspaper. They generally avoided controversial issues in the Saturday Evening News newspaper. They didn't talk a whole lot about suffrage, but the girls did go to suffrage meetings. And they avoided talking about union organizing because it was a touchy issue in the North End at the time. So they didn't want to antagonize the community. But they did talk and write articles about how they did not like attitudes that women should only get married and have children and take care of their homes and not be educated. So they wrote a lot of articles about that. They also were brave and came out and wrote articles sort of criticizing some of the Boston elite women who viewed them as just little ignorant immigrant women and children. And so Fanny's mission and the other Saturday Evening Girls was to show them, look, we are talented, intelligent, worthy young women, and we are part of this 20th century. Helen Storrow, she was an outdoors person. I explained that before. She and her husband were very physically active and loved exercise and fresh air. And so Helen was very much a holistic person. She was very interested in herbal remedies and dieting and with healthy foods and things like that. And she wanted these young women that were in the North End to have fresh air, because you can imagine without pollution controls and stuff like that, the North End was just dirty and gross, and it was horrible, and people were sick there all the time. So she decided, in order to help even improve and expand their lives and their worldviews and keep them healthy, Helen Storrow bought a 14-bedroom house on Wingersheek Beach in Gloucester in 1906, so that the Saturday evening girls could take turns going up there for 1 or 2 weeks at a time and enjoy some fresh air. And she provided all the food for, 200 girls who went up there back and forth in the summer. She paid for the transportation. She bought cows for milk. She made sure everything was kosher for the Jewish girls. And so dietary restrictions were very, very strict for everybody. They went fishing and clamming. And it really provided a respite for these girls and showed them a world beyond the docks and the crowded streets of the North End. Here are some of the girls just hanging on the beach. Look at those bathing suits with stockings. Can you imagine? Now, running the pottery was very expensive, and Helen Storrow, even though she paid for practically everything, all of the 250 girls that were in these clubs that went in and out of this building that she purchased for them, all had to participate in one way or another in supporting the clubs and the building. So the older girls, they would give a pot or two that could be sold, and that money would go towards the building. The little children who didn't work for money, they could come over and they could sweep or clear off a table or move things or, play their little instruments, and just something to participate that they knew that they were contributing to the maintenance and upkeep of the building. So Helen Storrow just had this huge mind about everybody participating together. And she would go too. She wasn't afraid to go and take a broom and sweep and do all that stuff. So she didn't sit around and order people. She participated as well. Helen Storrow was very much into dancing. She loved to dance, and she was very intrigued by dance from different ethnic groups. So she brought in teachers to teach the girls different dances from different countries. And the girls became renowned at their skills of dancing, and they would go around and perform and earn money, which was really great. And Isabella Stewart Gardner, they're over at the Fenway, hosted them a few times at her house, or her house, her castle. And the girls just found it amazing when they went there to see all the society people watching them on stage, and they were shocked because the Boston elite women were smoking cigarettes, and they never saw women smoking in the North End. And they also put on performances at the Storrow's residence in Lincoln, Massachusetts, which today is now the Carroll School, which is for children with not intellectual disabilities, but learning disabilities. It's been transformed into a big school. But they hosted many, many functions there where Helen had the girls come and dance and perform, and she danced right along with them. She was quite the character. By 1915, the pollution in the North End was so bad that Helen Storrow moved the pottery out into Brighton, and that's where it lasted until the 1940s. And some of the Saturday evening girls continued to work as potters until that time. The group, this is a photograph about 1920 of the oldest Saturday evening girls. And the club, kind of started to fall apart because immigrants were moving out of the North End. They were moving to, quote unquote, the suburbs, like Dorchester and Roxbury and other places. But these women stuck together as friends right through till the 50s and 60s. They continued to meet once a year. And Helen Storrow met with them as well until she died. And they all, many of them went on to college, which was unheard of for women in that time period. And of course, many of their children did too. The interesting thing about Helen Storrow and James is because they were such outdoors people, they became frustrated with how dirty Boston was. They became, at Helen's urging, she and James became very instrumental in the transformation of Boston with the Charles River Embankment Project in 1910. The project cleaned up the Charles River of all those open sewers that were flowing out of Beacon Hill right into the Charles River. And the project included damming up the river. Now you can see people clamming on the Charles River. For those of you who have no idea what the river looked like back in 1900, it didn't have the dam. It didn't have, by the Science Museum, there's the locks right there. It was all clam flats. It smelled bad. It was disgusting. People threw trash there. And like I said, it was an open sewer. It was just gross. Now, Storrow was actually ideal for spearheading this project because his grandfather, Charles Storrow, had been the principal architect and engineer for the building of the locks and dams and canals in Lawrence, Massachusetts, more than 50 years before that. So he had a keen understanding of how it could transform the Charles River and Boston by cleaning it up. He and Helen donated millions of dollars to the project privately. They donated money to have it done. They also, once the damming occurred, and here they're building the dam, they paid for this grassy area. So there's Beacon Street on the right, and so they paid to have it all landscaped. So it was a beautiful esplanade. It was a esplanade, not quite what it is today, but it was the start of it anyway. Helen, and of course there's the beautiful Charles River now that is a great recreation site because of the Storrows pushing through getting it dammed so that we could enjoy it. Helen also started the Women's City Club of Boston in 1913 for the benefit of middle and upper class women. Her husband, Jim Storrow, had started the Boston City Club for men, and she said, well, women need a club too. So she purchased this building on Beacon Street and Beacon Hill. And she had speakers come all the time and talk to the women. They had debates. Helen was very much into dress reform. She felt that the restrictive clothing of the late 19th and early 20th century was unhealthy for women, that they needed to breathe and relax and be able to move about. So that was one of her important topics. Curiously, though, considering that she was a descendant of the founding mothers of the women's suffrage movement, she was very hesitant to promote suffrage speakers at the Women's City Club or anywhere. Even though that did happen, she preferred not to step into the limelight when it came to suffrage. And I thought long and hard about why this would have happened. Why would she hesitate to be involved in the suffrage movement? And I can't quite figure it out. I think maybe, I don't know, does she not want to have everyone just look and have these expectations of her because of her grandmother and great aunt and her mother? I'm not sure. But she was not a full-fledged leader of the suffrage movement. She supported it, but she was not out there advocating in the newspapers like other women in Boston were. She was very much about democracy and how to practice being a good citizen. And of course, the vote was important to that, but she always was pushing people to come and talk about how governments worked and understanding how legislatures and city governments and even school committees worked. She was particularly interested in the Boston City School Board, and Jim Storrow was too. They both tried to push through reforms in how the schools were run and the school board. Unfortunately, Jim was on the wrong side of an idea to get rid of voting in the school board members. And his plan succeeded, and that meant that no women ended up on the school board, which they had been for quite some time. And it's a complicated story, but I'm sure Helen was pretty ticked off about that. Another amazing thing that she did was, so during World War I, Helen became very active in the preparedness movement. They had organizations that would get together, and women would make bandages and make supplies, pack up supplies for soldiers shipping off overseas during World War I. And she practiced in drills on, like, say, the field at Windsor School over in Brookline. And that activity made her become interested in the Girl Scout movement. And here she is, a picture with Juliet Lau. And she became fascinated by the movement. And because of its focus on outside activities, competence, and also civics and, being a good citizen. So she became one of the most important Girl Scout movers and shakers in the country behind Juliet Lau. In 1917, she started having training camps at her house in Lincoln, and then she purchased a camp in Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1917, where they established the first National Girl Scout Leaders Training School. And I believe it's still there, or maybe recently it closed. She also worked to create Cedar Hill, which was Cornelia Warren's estate, and that's still part of the Girl Scout organization there in Waltham. And she also, this is the Pine Tree Camp in Plymouth, Massachusetts, where the girls could go in the summertime. It was all about outdoor activity, empowering girls, giving them a confidence about their bodies, about their skills, their abilities, having camaraderie, and fresh air and exercise. She also was committed to World Girl Scouting, and she purchased a retreat in Switzerland, which is still there. It's called Our Chalet in Adelboden in Switzerland. And Girl Scouts from around the world still gather there. And as I write here, there are more than 10 million girls. I think it's up to 13 million girls and young women in 150 countries belong to the Girl Scout movement. And this is part of Helen Storrow's activism as wanting to make the world a better place, a more equal place, and give more opportunities to girls and women. In 1926, James Storrow died, and that left Helen an extremely wealthy woman all on her own. It was hard for her. They had been such close partners, but she became even more committed to making a difference in the few years that she had left. She went on to establish Storyton at the Eastern States Exposition. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but it's a site in Western Massachusetts where Helen went around and purchased 17th century historic homes around New England and had them brought to Storyton so they could create this village so that people could learn about the colonial period and So that's still there, and Eastern States Exhibition has its fair every year, and you can go there and visit. And this is because of Helen Storrow and her philanthropy. And she also was concerned about the plight of Jews in Germany and elsewhere during the 1930s. And she became fascinated with modern design. Anyway, she helped support Walter Gropius, who was part of the Bauhaus movement in Germany, the design movement. And she supported him and others who came to America, and they settled in Lincoln, and she helped them build their homes. And the Gropius House is now a public, it's a historic site, and you can visit. And in COVID, I think only 4 of you can visit at once, but you can go and look at his very cool modern designs that he built there, and Helen Storrow supported that. She died in 1944, and it was a great loss to everyone. She kept working as long as she could. She was terribly sick with cancer for quite some time, but she kept carrying on and supporting as many organizations as possible. When she died, she left millions of dollars to continue shaping and transforming the water side of Charles River. And upon her death, it took a few years, but the city of Boston created with her, some of her funds, they created Storrow Drive, which we can drive every single day. It doesn't quite match what Helen Storrow's vision was. She wanted it to be, the waterfront to be completely accessible to the citizens of Boston forever. The highway sort of breaks that up, but it did develop into a great way to access the city. And now, right now, they are transforming some of the access points to the waterfront so more citizens can access it. She was also instrumental in helping establish things like the sailing program on the Charles River, because she and her husband felt that the children of the city of Boston deserved to learn how to sail just like wealthy residents. And so the river, every time I'm down there, I think of the Storrows and their commitment to making that waterfront accessible and enjoyable, and places where people can hear music and learn to sail and walk and exercise, and get a little bit away from the hecticness of the city that's just a couple of blocks away. In 1949, there was a dedication of Storrow Drive to James Jackson Storrow and Helen Osborne Storrow. The memorial is there at the end of Gloucester Street. As you go over Storrow Drive, it's on the Esplanade. If you are ever walking down there, take a look at it. So not only was Helen Storrow really important, she was important to suffrage, yes, but she was important to think about the greater world of what women were doing in Boston and cities like Boston. It wasn't just, let's get the vote and then we're done. There were so many things going on in the world in the United States at the late 19th century and early 20th century. And she and women like her really focused on what can we do to make this world a better place? What can we do to show that women are capable of being equal to men, that they should have the same opportunities, same access? And in her way, being born in the middle of the 19th century, she was able to bring herself into the 20th century with more modern ideas, by being open, by understanding that education, first and foremost, was the key to a better future, and health and exercise was right up there as well. And she used her great wealth to make that possible for many, many women who went on to do great things all on their own. So her legacy lives on in the city of Boston, not only physically on the landscape, but I know there are many, many families out there whose ancestors were directly affected by the generosity of Helen Storrow. So I can take questions now.
Great. First of all, Kate, thank you very, very much. I know that was enjoyable to everyone, and I love the photos. I just want to make one comment. It's
Yep.
not uncommon how there were fewer books and reading rooms for girls than there were for boys. It's almost like the situation that we have with restrooms today.
Thank you.
I do think we had some questions in the chat, so let's see if we can get to some of these questions. Oh, yes, one from Raphael, I think that's you. How did the Starros make all this money that they were so generous with?
So Jim was, so first of all, he came from a wealthy family. The Cabots, lodges, blah, 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 blah. So there was some of that there. And his grandfather did help build that lock system in Lawrence, and he was an amazing engineer. Anyway, there was just lots of money in the family. But he was an exceptional lawyer with the firm Lee Higginson. And so he made a lot of money representing companies. He was involved with Alexander Graham Bell and AT&T way back, so he made money there. And then the Nash Motor Car Company, he was I don't know, he seemed to invest in all the right companies at the time that were growing. He had so much money that during World War I, there was a shortage of fuel oil, and cities were having trouble paying for it. So he donated like 1 million barrels of fuel oil or something to the city of Boston so they could keep things going, the steam pumps going and things. He just knew really how to invest very well, and he got lots of stock in these companies he was on the board of. Yeah. Oh, you're muted. You're muted, Jack.
You're probably happy that I am. I'm looking at the chat, and I don't see any other questions, so please don't be shy. I mean, I think it was a very provocative presentation. The surprising part of the presentation for me was the fact that Helen Starrow had the building blocks for women to know what to do with that vote.
That's right.
And I think that was the piece of it, that she was a suffragist in her own way of preparing women for the fact that we are ready for that next step to do that.
Right.
Worth it. But I am still curious as to why she wasn't active.
I think she's asking us to think of suffrage in a broader way, that it wasn't just about getting the vote, because women at the time were really doing many more things. They were transforming cities. They were trying to clean up cities. They were the movement. They were the power behind. Let's clean up these dense neighborhoods. This isn't fair. And she had that sensitivity, and I think a lot of women did. Everything gets focused on suffrage, but there was so much more. I think Bonnie Page was trying to say something,
she said she was surprised that Starrow Drive was named for both of them. Was it named for both of them? She and her husband?
Storrow Drive, yes, it was, but I think originally it was just going to be the James Jackson Storrow Drive, but someone, I think, smartly said, I think it should be Helen too.
Good idea. Now, I do see another question here from Judith, and Judith asks, can you tell us about her son? Do you know a little bit about her son?
So I don't know that much about him. He grew up, I have met the grandson. Also James Jackson Storrow. I think he's third or fourth. So I think the son was a lawyer as well, successful in his own right, very much in the background, very not open. And when I met the grandson, he told me that he was in third grade, and the teacher called on him and said, can you tell us about Storrow Drive? And he had no idea that it was named after his grandfather. So he's like, my family never talked about their wealth. They never talked about their accomplishments. They just said, you go do what you need to do. I think one of them was the editor of the Nation newspaper journal review, National Review, the Nation. The Nation. Mm-hmm. So anyway, they were involved in some politics, and the family is also, or Helen's family was also related to William Lloyd Garrison. Her aunt married William Lloyd Garrison's son, William Lloyd II. So the families were very intimately connected. So Yeah.
It's amazing how all those connections were made from the very beginning. It's just amazing. We do have another question.
Okay.
This is from Anne. Hi, Anne. And she wants to know, did Helen know Blanche Ames of Easton? You know the Easton Ameses, the shovel factory and all of that?
I don't know. Probably. I have no idea.
Right. And then the second question is also from Anne. Did the suffrage movement gain strength from women's wealth like Helen and Blanche Ames?
Oh, absolutely. So, of course, their argument was winning advocates, but they needed money, just like any movement. Just today, that needs money. They needed it back then too. So the wealthy women, they had access to media, and they could buy buildings and have offices where they could have meetings. Helen established the Boston Women's City Club, but her mother established a Women's City Club in Auburn, New York. So she was kind of copying her mother. Mm-hmm. So that was her way of doing that. You think of like the Women's Trade Union store, that thing on Boylston Street.
Boylston Street, yeah.
Right. So the women funded that, and so yes, wealthy women had to spend their money and make things move along, because it just wasn't marching in the street, wasn't getting them anywhere.
Right. Well, that's wonderful. And this is a question from my friend Kathy Hillman from West Springfield. And she wants to know, why did Helen choose West Springfield to build the little village of the old houses? She taught in West Springfield, by the way.
Oh, that's nice. So I'm not entirely sure, but her sister married a guy named Frederick. I think his name was Frederick Harris. And I think that's why they went out and they lived in Springfield. So I think maybe that's why. Maybe it has to do with Harris family money and Storrow. I'm not really sure. I don't know that history very well, but I bet there's that connection with her sister and brother-in-law.
I never knew it was named after someone. Oh, Thornton, never in any clue.
There you go.
Thank you for the question. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Well, I just think that Helen had a way of wanting to bring her message everywhere. She brought it out of the country, so why not to Western Mass?
Right.
It is like another country.
And you know what I liked? I think the two of them, Jim and Helen, they were simpatico. I mean, they loved the outdoors. They were so she was so athletic. Not a lot of women were back then. Mm-hmm. And if they were shy about showing it off. She was not. And she was married to a man was like, go at it, just have at it. This is great. Do what you want. And that I think is really important, that they had a great partnership. And he supported her efforts and she supported his, and they had a passion together. When in 1910, when they were really pushing to clean up the Charles River, you wouldn't believe how the Beacon Hill folks were like, no way, you're not doing that. And he was like furious. And so was she, because that sewerage was just flowing right into the river. So they didn't mind taking on the elites, even though he came from that in that community. So he benefited from her sensibilities and her support and vice versa. It was really, I think, a great partnership.
Great, thank you. We have another question. This is from Bonnie Page. Hi, Bonnie, how are you? And she'd like to know, did Helen receive a lot of pushback for her endeavors? I know that that happens when women try to be a little aggressive in our day and age. So what happened to her?
Yeah, I think she did. So when I did my research, there were women that did not like her because she was not warm and fuzzy. She was very matter of fact, very direct, and she did what she said. And other elite women didn't like that. They preferred to be more demure or be in the background and order people around. And some of them were horrified when she'd get out there and start dancing with all those girls. I mean, they just could not believe it. Yeah. So she kind of broke some of the rules, and they didn't really care for that too much. But she didn't care. She was like, I'm doing this, you know.
Okay, and now we have, you are just generating tons of interest. So here's another question. And the question says, this is from Sally. Hi, Sally Sennett. Did her son carry on any of her work? Do we know anything about that, or anyone else in the family?
Yeah, so I don't know. I'm not sure. The grandson has been interested in the Saturday Evening Girls history and what happened to them. And we've had some like reunions of the children and grandchildren of the Saturday Evening Girls. And he has come to them, and it has brought him great joy. I know, because he was so proud of Helen and his grandfather. So, but I don't know, other than that, what he's done. Excuse me.
You need a sip of water while I make a little comment. By the way, that pottery, the Saturday Evening Girls pottery, was exceptional. It was exceptional, just lovely. I just thought it was really lovely.
Right.
And we do have another question.
It wasn't just slapped together. I mean, this was serious, and she made them know this is serious. You're not just playing here. This is really important.
Right. And we do have another question, and this is from Judith again. Judith, thank you again. Any books about Helen Starrow?
Yeah.
No.
She says this was fantastic, by the way.
So there's this little pamphlet that was written. Did you see it? I don't know. I can't. It was written in 1970 by Leonard Ware, and I think it might have been maybe a fundraiser for Storyton. I'm not really sure.
Mm-hmm.
But about that, and there's a book written about James Storrow from like 1945 or something like that. So.
And Kathy Hillman again. Here you are, Kathy. It says, is there a list of Saturday Evening Girls? Is there a listing of any of that?
So I have a list of about 210 names. A lot of the records are at Schlesinger Library. The organizational records of the North Bennett Street School are at Schlesinger Library, and there you can find some of the girls' names. And some of the descendants of Saturday Evening Girls have deposited papers with Schlesinger Library. So, and I had planned on writing a book about the Saturday Evening Girls, but I just haven't gotten around to finishing it. And, you know, maybe after Fannie Lou Hamer, I don't know.
Is Fannie Lou still in the works?
Oh, yeah, very much so. Yeah.
Good. That's very good. And this is a comment that I just need to read. It's from my friend Bill Durkee. He said, please tell Kate that the presentation was wonderful, as all of her presentations in the past for retiree programs have been. So
thank you.
Yeah, big kudos from Bill Durkee, and it's so very, very true. I don't know if we have any other questions or any other comments, but I do want to remind everyone that Sarah has put in the chat the link to the survey. If we would like feedback, I know everyone's been excited with the program, but please, we would like to hear your feedback. And if you have any other ideas for Dr. Larson to put together a presentation for us, she's very amenable.
I hope Dr. Watson writes that book.
Thank you.
About Helen Storrow.
Thank you. I do see a couple other questions here, though, but one is about, did Helen have a role in the West End community? So she, tangentially, yes. So her husband was very much involved in the West End Boys Club, West End, the Newsboys, everything. And Fanny Goldstein, who was a Saturday Evening Girl, became the head librarian at the West End Branch Library. And I remember when I started doing this research years and years ago, I had people coming up to me that had grown up in the West End, and they remembered Fanny because she was like a battle axe. But she was dedicated to all those kids learning and exploring. And she actually established Jewish History Week, now Jewish History Month, and she became, very high up in the Boston Public Library system. She was the first Jewish librarian in the Boston Public Library system. So tangentially through that, she was Fanny was amazing, an amazing, amazing woman who started with very little, and because of Storrow and Gary Aaron Brown really moved up. so I know there are a lot of people who come out of the West End who are very grateful to the Storos for what they did.
Right. It's too bad they destroyed the West End.
Yeah,
I
right.
do see another question here from Bev Lowry. Did I hear correctly that you wrote a book on Rosemary Kennedy? Yes.
Yes.
And I suppose she might be interested in it. So,
so that book has been out 5 years this year. It came out in 2015, and it's a biography of Rosemary, and it's the first biography of her. And I think that the story is so important because it centers Rosemary right in the middle of that family. And when you put Rosemary at the center of the Kennedy family, the family looks very different. And some of the things, I have come to deeply appreciate about that family, because these Joe and Rose, we all know about Joe and Rose, but the siblings really were transformed as human beings because of their sister Rosemary, and her legacy lives on in their work and in every ADA compliant, walkway and stairway and doorway that you come to is directly linked to the work of the Kennedys because of their sister Rosemary.
thank you.
Thank you. I very much enjoyed hearing about Helen Storrow, but you just jogged my memory when you mentioned Rosemary. And I had heard of her, but I really didn't know that much about her. And once I got the book, I couldn't put it down. Your research was wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Beverly. Question, Raphael, do you have a question about the Agassiz connection? You have to unmute yourself.
Yes, you mentioned Pauline Agassiz Shaw, and I wonder what is the relation between her and the biologist Agassiz from Harvard that is so controversial.
He was her father.
I see.
Yeah. So, yeah, I know he's very controversial. She wasn't so much, she did so much for everybody. And I don't know what this, I'm not going to get into Louis Agassiz. But she married into the Shaw family. Robert Gould Shaw was the remarkable young man who was the leader of the Massachusetts 54th Black Regiment that fought so bravely at Fort Wagner battle in South Carolina in the summer of 1863, and that magnificent monument dedicated to the Massachusetts 54th at the State House in Boston. So she married into that family.
Okay. Bonnie Page, where are you? Do you want to ask your question? Or would you like me to read it? Bonnie, are you?
I'll ask.
There you go. Hi, Bonnie.
Hi. I'm so enjoying this. I have to read everything you're writing. I went to Wheelock College in Boston, and Lucy Wheelock was a very big person in the kindergarten field. And did Pauline Shaw have a connection with her? Because you said Elizabeth Peabody. I know Elizabeth Peabody was one of Lucy Wheelock's mentors. So I was curious about that.
Yeah, I don't know. I would imagine she did, but I don't know. I do know this about Pauline. Even though she was really active in the 1880s and 1890s, I'm not sure when she died, but she did suffer tragically from depression. Like, she would go in her room for months and not come out. So I don't know as she got older, I think it got worse. And so I don't know if she kind of stepped out of the limelight by the 1890s and maybe missed all the other stuff. I don't know. I have no idea, but that would be.
Wheelock was started in 1888.
Well,
yeah.
So maybe she knew her.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Bonnie. Great question. Nice to see you. Okay, let's see. No one is being shy, which is a wonderful thing.
Yes.
So would anyone have any other questions, or should we have just have a reminder about the survey again? I think that Sarah has the link up in the survey again, but before we end this wonderful presentation, I do have to say, Kate, I cannot thank you enough I know that
Oh.
when we chatted on the phone, you thought it was a great idea that we would do something about the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. And you brought up Helen Sturrow, and I knew nothing except Sturrow Drive. And now I just can't imagine how wonderful I would have loved to have met her. And I think that we did that today through your presentation.
Thank you very much.
I can't thank you enough. And like I said, we'll come up with another idea. Take your little brain, get something over.
Thank you.
Sarah.
Thank you so much.